Hi, welcome and thank you for being here tonight. My name is Sue Clace. We're here tonight to present the Community Reading Storytelling Project. Just a couple of reminders. If you are using this presentation for your GEP or APS class, please make sure you get started on your reflection paper soon so that the presentation content is fresh in your mind, and the instructors recommend writing your reflection within 1 week of the presentation. Our presentations relate to the key themes of your first year summer assignment, including advocacy, perseverance, community, and tonight's theme, passion. Okay, let's get started. Our presenter today is Dr. Kyle Green, Assistant Professor of Sociology here at SUNY Brockport. Please join me in welcoming him.
Should I get started?
All right, you are on.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to start a slideshow, which I'm assuming you all can see, and Sue can stop me if anything's going wrong. I won't be monitoring the chat, but Sue, do feel free to stop me if anything comes up where people can't see or there needs to be more information. So my name is Kyle Green. I'm a professor of sociology, or assistant professor of sociology at Brockport, and I titled my talk Some Moments. And the reason I did this is I decided not to give that normal story where you start at the beginning, you get to the middle, and you work to the end, a nice narrative arc. That's useful. I often find that's a little bit artificial. So instead, I'm just going to share 5 or 6 stories from experiences or moments that I had that I think reveal something about how I became a sociologist, connections to sport, and why I think this stuff is exciting and important to study. Before I get into those details, I just want to give a little bit of overview of where I came from and how I ended up at Brockport. I'm guessing I might even have some of the first year students who are taking intro to sociology. You might know some of this stuff. Maybe you forgot it, and it doesn't hurt, I guess, to hear it twice. So originally I'm from Otsego County. It's that tiny spot, tiny county right in the center of New York. Grew up in a really rural town. There were 300 people. I was 3 miles outside of town, not an area with a ton of affluence. My family didn't have a lot of money either, which is going to end up being important for the story and some of the experiences that I talk about. So I went off to college all the way over here at SUNY Geneseo. So I'm over in SUNY Geneseo school, very much like SUNY Brockport, majored in geography and philosophy. And then after I got my degree, and one of the things that's important is my 4th year, I heard about grad school. I came from a family where no one knew anything about advanced degrees. That wasn't something that people did. It wasn't something that we thought about. So in my senior year, I heard about grad school. I realized it was something that I wanted to pursue, but I didn't have time to actually apply. So I went back to Otsego County, went back to that small town of Gilbertsville where I grew up. I was substitute teaching while I studied for the GREs to get ready to apply for grad school. And then I also traveled in South America for a bit. So I applied to grad school, go off to grad school at the University of Minnesota. I got my master's in geography, and then I switched over to my PhD, switched over to sociology for my PhD. One side note I'll make is if you ever want to hear about how grad school works, why you might consider going to grad school, why you might not consider going to grad school, what the application process is like, ask your professors. We've gone through this experience. Your professors will be happy to talk about that with you. And if you haven't done it before, which none of you have, if you don't have a family member who's gone through this process, it's kind of a mystery, right? It was a mystery for me, so it's useful to talk to people. So I go off, I get my PhD in sociology. While I'm completing my PhD, I teach for a year at the University of Minnesota, and then I also teach for a semester at Carleton College, which is about an hour south of Minneapolis. After I'm done, I apply all around the country looking for a tenure track job, and I somehow end up back in central New York. So you'll recognize this map again. So we're back in central New York. I'm at Utica College for 3 years. There were some great things about Utica College. There were some things that were not so great. So I ended up applying to SUNY Brockport when there was a job opening. And now this is my 3rd year in the sociology department at SUNY Brockport. Now, I am a sociologist who studies culture and theory and gender. But I do this through looking at sports. And that's what I'm going to end up focusing on in this talk today, trying to give a little bit of an explanation of why I'm so excited about sports and why I also think it's so useful to look at, why it's a place worth studying. Now, as I've studied culture and gender and theory through sports, I've done a lot of things related to that. So in the top left, you can see a picture of a basketball court. So I've written about end one basketball or street basketball. So that was one of the first projects I was engaged in. I've written about Super Bowl commercials. You see one in the top right, and how Super Bowl commercials convince people to buy products through selling a particular brand of masculinity. I've looked at race and basketball, and in particular, I co-authored an article on Jeremy Lin and thinking about the experience of Asian Americans in the space of the NBA. I've looked at, let's skip to the bottom right, I've studied binge drinking among ex-athletes, and I did that with a public health professor back at University of Minnesota. Bottom left, you can see a representation of sports and politics. So I've written a number of articles on sports and politics, and I'll return to that at the end of this talk also. And then the final subject, which I've probably devoted the most time to, this was the focus of my dissertation. I've published 4 articles on the topic. I have another out there in the works, is looking at the growth of mixed martial arts in the United States. So looking at people who choose to spend their lunch after work learning to fight each other, punching, kicking, choking, doing all those things to each other. So looking at both the growth at the national level with successful companies like the Ultimate Fighting Championship, but also looking at people who choose to do this in their leisure activities. So now I'm going to get into these 5 or 6 stories. But one thing I do want to say, going back to the title, when I'm sharing these stories, actually, let me skip ahead to this slide. Oh yeah, one other thing I wanted to mention, I also have 2 podcasts. So I've got Give Theory a Chance podcast, Give Methods a Chance podcast. These relate to my interests, but we're not going to spend much time on that. Now, the other thing I'll say is not only am I a professor who studies this type of stuff, but I'm also a sports fan, right? And that's part of the reason that this passion underlies everything that I do. And one of the things I'm going to encourage you to do is whatever you study, make sure you're passionate about it. It doesn't matter if it's sports, doesn't matter if it's looking for a cure for asthma, doesn't matter if you're looking at measuring worms and seeing how it changes with climate, the size of a worm, just making up something. It seems like it could be a good project, but make sure you're passionate about it, right? If you're going to be spending a lot of time doing something, you want to actually care about that thing at some deep level. So I, on some deep level, am a sports fan. I've been a fan of tennis for many years. I taught myself tennis in middle school, and I'll talk a little bit about that experience. I spent too much time playing video games like these, like Street Fighter and Smash Brothers, which I consider to be a sport type activity, right? This competitive thing where you go against another person. I am still a fan of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, that violent sport that you can see in the top right. And I'm a fan of basketball. I've been a fan of basketball since I'm 5 years old. The Sacramento Kings, who you see there, especially when Chris Webber was there, was my favorite team of all time. I still watch every playoff game. I'm rooting for the Heat right now against the Lakers. So I have a passion for this thing. But as I entered academia, I almost became embarrassed about being a sports fan, right? Because in academia, in these places of higher learning, there's this separation between heart or body, which you see on the left, or I guess the right of the screen, but our left in that picture, and the mind, where there's an emphasis on thought and intellect. And when you express things about sport, it's almost seen as being beneath these things that matter, right? If you're someone who studies culture, it is seen as this elegant pursuit. When I say I study culture through sport, I often get labeled as a sport sociologist, right? So part of the thing that I had to overcome is I'm passionate about sports. I have to convince people why it's worth studying. Now, one of the reasons it is such a challenge to do so is because as much as we are obsessed with sports in our society, and we are a sport-obsessed society, right? We spend billions and billions of dollars every year on sport. That's through contracts for athletes, that's through building stadiums, that's through ticket attendance, that's through television deals. We spend a ton of money on sports in our society. It's a giant industry. We also spend a lot of time. We watch games, we go to games, we talk about games. The sports section of the newspaper is always the most popular section of the newspaper. And we also invest our passion into it. When our favorite team loses, if you're a sports fan, it's not rare to see another fan or yourself break into tears. When they win, it's not strange to see people scream with excitement, right? So we love sports, but our love of sports is only matched by an equal belief that it's not worthy of deeper or critical thought. Right? When people start to dissect sport and think about what it means, oftentimes people are saying, well, don't do that, right? That's not what sports is about. It's just a game. It's just silly. When politics get brought up in sport, oftentimes we push it away. So that's one of the things going into studying sport. I fell into this trap too. I loved sports. I didn't realize it was something that could be worthy of deeper study. So I want to think in this talk, looking at these moments in my life, how my experiences in sport almost pushed me to start considering it, right? To start reflecting on, what am I doing in this space? Why does it matter so much? Why do I invest so much time? Why do I love this thing? But like, what is going on here? I think that's the basis of a lot of really good research questions, right? You're interested and you're curious. You know something matters, but you can't quite figure out what. So I'm going to share these 5 stories. Now, all these stories are related to sports, and I might share number 6 if we have time. I'm keeping an eye. I'm not sure if we'll get to 6 stories or not, because I don't want to keep you too long. But I'm going to share these 5 stories. The other thing that's key about these stories, not only are they related to sport, but in some way they're all disjunctions. And what I mean about that is I always loved being involved in sports, whether it was being a fan or whether it was playing. But each of these stories are about cases where I felt slightly out of place. Even though I was attracted to the space, even though I liked what I was doing, I still felt like I wasn't perfectly synchronized, right? I wasn't perfectly in tune with what was going on. And one of the arguments I make in sociology is that those are the moments that force us to reflect on ourselves and force us to reflect on our surroundings. We have to say, what am I doing here? How are other people acting? Why do I feel out of place? What's not right about this? When you feel perfectly in tune, you often don't ask yourself those questions, right? And sometimes we actually seek out spaces where we feel a little bit out of place because we want to reflect. This is a chance for change. This is a chance for having an internal dialogue. So each of these stories fits that. They're all sports stories, but they all have a little bit of disjunction. So let's start with the first sports story. And I don't have any videos, I don't have any audio. I just have a few images to bring you into the story itself. Each story is going to be probably 4 minutes long, and then I'll just do a little bit of analysis thinking about why it matters. So we won't spend, none of the stories will spend a huge amount of time. And feel free to ask follow-ups for any of these in the questions. Questions are great, and it could be a really simple question. It could be a really complex question. Anything's fine. So when I was in probably, it would have been 8th grade, I was on the basketball team, and there was a star player on the team who in 8th grade had already moved up to varsity. So he was a very talented player. Now, one thing you have to consider is this is a small rural town in New York, so it wasn't like the competition was that high, but he was still really good. He moved up to varsity in 8th grade, and I didn't realize this at the time, and this is one of the reasons I'm telling this story is the adults of the town cared about this, which is kind of strange when you think about it. But the adults in the town really wanted to have a successful high school basketball team, and they rallied around this. And one of the things they did was they offered a scholarship for a single player, young player, a middle schooler who came from a poor background, who would not have been able to afford to go to basketball camp. And they gave him a scholarship and they sent him off to camp with the goal. And they only did this with the boys, which also says something. They didn't care as much about the girls' team, but for the boys' team, they sent off a single kid, and they did it with the goal of improving the quality of basketball with the hope of getting that sectional championship. So in my case, they knew that this other kid, one of my friends was the star player who moved up to varsity. So they chose me as that poor kid to send off to basketball camp. So they sent me to Sydney, New York, which is about 20 minutes from where I grew up. And I went to Golden Valley Sports Camp. So I went to camp on the very first day. It's middle of summer, hot day. You're playing outside. So you play outside for the first part of the day. And then at lunch break, it's time for the swim test. And the reason they do the swim test is one of the best things about going to camp is this idea. You go to camp, you play the first part of the day, you get really hot, you're playing basketball, you're doing drills. And then before lunch, you get to jump in the pool, swim around, and then you go have lunch. I didn't know how to swim, and I was really embarrassed about it. I grew up, again, small town in New York. One of the things people learned to do was either swim through learning to swim in rivers, taking swimming lessons, or people had pools if they had a little bit more money. For whatever reason, I didn't do any of those things. So I did the thing that any smart kid would do when they really don't want to admit to all these. I didn't know anyone at the camp, so I didn't want to admit that I was this person who didn't know how to swim. So I acted like I had a stomach ache and a headache, and they sent me to the nurse. And the nurse is like, oh, you know, it's hot out, so you don't need to take the test. You can schedule it for another time. Of course, I had no intention of scheduling it for another time because I didn't know how to swim. It wasn't like I was going to learn overnight. So I faked this not feeling well. And then, so what happened for all the kids who didn't know how to swim is that we would, instead of swimming, we would get to play pool, we would get to play foosball, we would get to play all these games in this air-conditioned site, this building. So all the other kids were swimming and having a great time. Kids who didn't know how to swim, they would go play all these other games. Now, what I quickly realized was I was the only white kid at the camp who didn't know how to swim, right? I grew up in this small rural town in New York. If you looked at my school, it was the extreme opposite of diversity. Whatever that thing diversity means to us, it was not happening at my school. There was not a single kid who wasn't white in my class. Now, I had a small class, only 47 people graduated. All 47 of the kids in my class were white. So in this space, I was because I didn't know how to swim, suddenly all my friends at camp, all the people I was hanging out during lunch were all black, right? So I was the lone white kid. There were a bunch of black kids from the city, and it made more sense that a lot of them didn't know how to swim, or all the people in this space, right? Because they came from the city, didn't have access to the pool, didn't have access to swimming lessons, and all these sociological reasons to explain it. But suddenly I had this new experience where instead of me being the extreme majority, suddenly I was in this tiny space, a minority. Now, that played a big role for me, right? These were the friends that I built connections with. These were the people I stayed in touch with years after basketball camp. Suddenly I was talking about issues related to race, even though I didn't even have those ideas or words in my mind at that point. Suddenly I started to listen to rap music, and music that I continue to listen today. So in that moment of disjunction, feeling somewhat out of place, it allowed me to have these new experiences, which says a lot about sports, right? Where are those places outside of basketball, outside of football, where you have those type of interactions across racial groups, right? Where you share this experience, that it facilitates something. So already on some level, I was starting to realize that this mattered. Even thinking about the role models I had, growing up in a town that was extremely homogenous in terms of the racial background. And here I was, this white kid in this rural setting. And if you look at the posters on my wall as I'm growing up, you have Sean Kemp and Gary Payton, two supersonics, two black athletes. Where else do you have that happen outside of sport? So already I was realizing something. So thinking about my story and how this passion for basketball shaped who I am, it's not surprising. Perhaps it's not surprising that I do something related to race and sport and basketball in my own research. All right, let's go on to the next story. And again, happy to answer more things. All right, thinking about the basketball team that I was on. So I come back from basketball camp, and you can actually see, so this would have been my 9th grade basketball team. So the year after I went to basketball camp, you can actually see me over there, number 23, which I chose because of Michael Jordan. Even though I didn't like Michael Jordan, I still thought he was the greatest player, so I wanted to have his number. So I'm wearing number 23. That's my basketball team. You can also see what I was talking about in terms of racial diversity, right? Very, very white space, Gilbertsville, New York. So that's the basketball team I'm on. And when you grow up in and play sports in upstate New York, one of the things you get used to is taking long bus rides, right? Towns are spread out. So whenever you're playing against another team, you have to take a bus ride. So one of the things I still remember, and it's strange that it stuck with me to this degree, but we're on the bus, we're taking a ride to, we might have been playing Cherry Valley. So it was like an 1.5-hour bus ride. It was one of the longest bus rides you take when you're playing, when you're on Gilbertsville Mount Upton basketball team. And I just started it was actually my first like real girlfriend at the time. So I'm starting to date someone, and the rest of the team was excited and obsessed with asking a question of whether I had engaged in any sexual activity, right? This was this weird obsession that was taking place. Now, I'm not trying to make myself out as some sort of impressive moral person where I knew that it was wrong to talk about that thing, and that's why it bothered me. It wasn't that, right? It was this disjunction that occurred, this kind of unease, and I didn't know exactly why, but I didn't want to answer those questions, right? There was something weird about it. And already in that moment, didn't start to articulate it yet, didn't start to think about why it bothered me, but I knew I didn't like this idea that here's this group of boys all together in the back of the bus, and there's this obsession with learning whether or not someone's had sex, if they haven't had sex, learning about what they've done, and then learning about every little detail imaginable. And not only trying to learn the details, but in a sense using it as a way to understand acceptance into that group, right? To engage in the act might move up your status in the hierarchy. To have not engaged in the act could be something people would joke about. Again, I wasn't approaching it as a sociologist yet, but I already had to start asking those sociological questions. Why is it when a group of people in a setting where it's just a group of just boys or a group of just girls asks those type of questions? How do people respond to it? When does it seem positive and when does it seem negative? What does sport do, right, in terms of teaching gender roles? Who's left out or excluded, right? What if I was someone who didn't want to have a girlfriend? What if I was someone who wanted to engage in a relationship with someone of the same sex? What if I was someone who didn't want to engage in relationships at all, right? Those things weren't an option. Instead, there was this delight in gathering details as part of the group. So already thinking about things that I study now, I study gender and sexuality. I study race. Those can be traced back to my experiences and my passion for being a basketball player, which is kind of funny to think about. When I started playing basketball, I didn't think it would lead in these directions. All right, another story, taking a little bit of a turn away from basketball. When I was, let's see, I would have been about 10 or 11 years old. My brother was a high school and then college wrestler, so he was 8 years older than me. And he went off to college, so it's first year in college, and he returned and he had this grainy VHS tape. So the younger students in class will have probably never seen a VHS tape. This was before DVD players, before streaming, but you get a VHS tape. You go to the video rental store, which is also disappearing, and he brought home this tape, and you can see the cover of the video, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, the beginning. It shocked the world and it started it all. UFC 1, finally on video, unedited, uncensored, unleashed. And you can even see the mature audience warning. So I knew something exciting was happening. I didn't know what it was, but I knew there was something exciting happening. And now I was this kid, like I said before, I played video games, I played Street Fighter, I liked martial arts movies. So I was aware of this kind of mystic fighting, this thing that it seemed exciting that existed out there in the world. So he brings home this tape, and the first UFC, which was in the 1994 in the United States, pitted people of different fighting styles against each other, which as the cover advertisement really pushes, it's unedited, it's uncensored, it's unleashed, meaning it's bloody, right? There's not rules, there's not weight classes, there's not a time limit. It's this violent thing that is going to be consumed. In the very first match that ever occurred, this is what brought mixed martial arts to the United States. You have on the left a sumo wrestler from Hawaii versus a kickboxer, a Dutch kickboxer. No one knows what's going to happen. The sumo wrestler rushes across the octagon or the cage. He gets punched in the face. He falls because he slips, and the kickboxer kicks him in the face. When he kicks him in the face, he knocks out one tooth of the sumo wrestler, and another tooth gets lodged in his foot. The sumo wrestler is stunned, obviously, and hurt, doesn't know really how to quit because this is this kind of new practice that's occurring. The referee is hesitating because they don't really know when they're supposed to stop the fight. They're not supposed to stop unless one of the fighter requests to give up or is knocked unconscious. So he just stands there, and the sumo wrestler receives more punches. This is this violent, brutal thing that we're watching, but immediately I was drawn to it, right? I was curious about it. I didn't know what was going on. And thinking of that disjunction, it was strange. It was new. It didn't seem like a normal sport. It related to these martial arts movies that I like to watch, but it wasn't as fancy. And yet I was still interested in it. The other thing that's important here is thinking about the context, right? I'm watching this with my brother, who's 8 years older than me, and my father. The three of us, mostly my father and his two children, we're not very close. We didn't really get along, right? But yet we come together around sport. So what is sport doing? This brutal, violent sport is offering this space where we all come together, watch it, and then talk about it. And every time there would be a new UFC, every time my brother would come home from college, the first thing he would do is he would ride his motorcycle to Oneonta, New York, where there was a video rental store, and check if the new UFC was available, right? It became this ritual that brought the family together, but only the male members of the family. So again, thinking about this new sport that I'm interested in, but also thinking about what it does to be fans, what the appeal is. All right, again, shifting it up a little bit. So in 7th grade, I began teaching myself how to play tennis. So I got myself a racket and I would bike the 3 miles down to Gilbertsville, and I would meet up with a few other friends from school, and we learned how to play tennis together. We would all watch tennis on TV, and then we'd imitate what we saw. Tennis lessons was not something that was even thinkable. We didn't know where to go. You would have had money to do that. You would have had to go off to one of the towns. You would have to drive there. We began to advocate for ourselves, which is kind of interesting. So sport became a place where we learned to advocate for ourselves. So we painted the lines on the court when they were getting faded. We sent letters and mailed it to town officials when the net was damaged, and the town officials actually replaced the nets, which was this nice thing. So I began to play tennis, and I began to play it more and more and really push myself. When I went off to SUNY Geneseo, I even thought about joining the tennis team. I didn't know if I would make the basketball team. I had a feeling if I did that I would never play, which was probably an honest assessment of where I was at. But I was curious what would happen in tennis. Unfortunately, Geneseo had just cut the tennis team, so that was not an option. So I played intramurals, and first 2 years of intramural tennis, I won. So I considered myself the best tennis player at Geneseo. And in the third year, I realized there was one person. This has nothing to do with the story, the point I'm making, but it's just something that sticks with me. Dave Thomas was at Geneseo, and he was the one player that was better than me. So every time we played, he would beat me, which was frustrating. And I have no idea where Dave Thomas is now. But anyway, so during the summers, I would go home. Now I had a car, and I would go off to Oneonta, and at SUNY Oneonta, they hosted a tennis tournament. So I would go off to Oneonta. I entered the tennis tournament, and the first thing I realized when I pulled up for the tournament, I didn't know anyone there. So I pulled up for my scheduled match, and I was driving this old beaten up Ford and barely ran. I was happy when it would start, and it would break down all the time. The engine lit on fire one time. It was brutal. You could hear when I pulled in because the muffler was never really working quite right. So I get to this tennis tournament, and the first thing I notice when I look around is that all these other people getting out. Some of them were my age, some of them were older, but they're all getting out of really nice cars, right? The type of cars that you knew were serviced every year. The type of car that you knew the engine would not just randomly light on fire. At the very least, you knew the engine would light on fire, right? And the other thing I noticed when people are getting out is they all I just carried my racket around. Everyone had a nice tennis bag with spare rackets, which was also incredible. They had nice rackets, and then they had a second of the same racket. And a lot of people were wearing polo shirts, even though you weren't at Wimbledon, right? It wasn't required to wear a polo shirt. But instead, everyone looked and played the part. Everyone knew how to act on the tennis court. So I would compete, but I immediately felt like an outsider, right? Every single person there, it seemed, got private lessons. Every single person, it seemed, had this background of money. And so again, this was this element of disjunction. Here's this sport that I can compete at, right? Here's this sport that I'm at the same level as these people that I'm playing at. But when I go to this space, and these are some of the actual sponsors of the tournament, and one of the trophies that is given out by Chobani. When I went, Chobani was not sponsoring, and the trophy wasn't that nice. But you can see the class background of these people, right? So in terms of disjunction, here's a space where in terms of skill, in terms of sport, in terms of race, right? In terms of the region that I grew up, I fit in every way, but still I felt somewhat out of place. And I started to think, okay, how is it that sport actually divides population? How is it the sport that we like tells us something about our background, whether it's our racial background, whether it's our ethnic background, or in this case, whether it's our class background? So again, a passion that I have, but as I have this disjunction that I work through, it makes me start to think critically about this activity that I love. All right, now to mixed martial arts. Jumping ahead again. So we're jumping around in terms of sports, we're jumping around in terms of time, but I want to take you to the very first time I trained in mixed martial arts. So I'm a grad student at University of Minnesota. I've remained a fan of the UFC for all these years since I had that grainy VHS tape brought home to me by my brother. And I was starting to look for a dissertation. I had been writing about basketball. I wrote about the globalization of basketball. I wrote about street ball and how it gets advertised. And I felt like those were good papers, but I didn't think it was something that I could write a whole book on. So here was this thing, MMA. It had gone through this period of extreme controversy. Now it was starting to get popular and be seen as a legitimate sport, and yet no one was really writing about it. So during the summer, when I went back to Gilbertsville, New York again to visit my family, I decided to go off to Oneonta, New York, and check out a local MMA gym. And I didn't know what it would be like, right? I had no idea who the people would be when I walked through that door. I had never trained in a martial art. I had definitely never trained in mixed martial arts. So I go to the gym, and this is actually that gym closed, and the people who started that first gym that I went to opened this gym, which you see here. So I go to that gym, and the very first day, they have me start training just the grappling side. So I wasn't working boxing and kicks or kickboxing or Muay Thai yet. The very first day, he has me, the coach or the head person has me match up with a member who had been there for a while. This bigger guy, probably has like 70 pounds on me. At that time, I was probably 25 years old, and he was, I would guess, in his early 40s. And we start wrestling. I don't really know what I'm doing, so we roll around the ground. It seems like we're doing it for like 20 minutes because I'm exhausted. Probably we're only doing it for like 2 minutes. So he chokes me over and over. He catches me and joint locks over and over. I'm sweating and breathing hard. He's barely sweating. He's breathing a little bit. And we stop after he's choked me out a few times, and I give up. And first he says a few things about what I should be doing while we're training. And then within a minute, right, we barely met each other. We trained for a little bit. He told me a few technical pointers. And then he starts telling me all these details about his life. He starts explaining how his marriage is falling apart and he's going to get divorced. He starts talking about how he has this job where he's comfortable and successful, but he's really bored, and he's thinking about whether he wants to take that risk in doing something else. He starts making connections between training and MMA and making those life decisions, and talking about how MMA teaches him confidence and teaches him a willingness to take a risk when he is bored at his job. These are things that you might not share with someone who you've been friends with for 3 years, right? These are things you might not share with a coworker who you've run into in the hallway for 10 years. And yet he's sharing all this stuff with me within 5 minutes of meeting me, right? And so that was a point, again, an element of disjunction. I'm finding this thing that I'm going to be passionate about. I'm already a big fan. I'm going to get incredibly invested in training in this activity. But something seems a little bit strange. And I'm realizing that for all these people on the site, they're also entering a space that they love, but it's that out of place feeling where suddenly they feel like they can tell stories. Suddenly they have to start explaining and justifying why they're there doing this activity that's in front of you, right? Why are these people? Why is this guy right here who's a classical and jazz pianist who's incredibly successful rolling around where he could hurt his fingers? Right? Why is this high school, this guy on the ground? Why is this high school biology teacher doing this thing, right? It doesn't necessarily make sense. So again, this moment of passion and also a moment of disjunction that led to me doing research and continuing to talk about and study sports. And then this is the final story. I'll just share this really quick since we're past that 30-minute mark. I only wanted to share this one. You can actually see me in the back right here, which is kind of an embarrassing photo. The person in front of me is a professional mixed martial arts fighter from Japan. He came out to Minnesota to do one of his training camps, so he trained at the same gym that I was at to prepare for his, I think his third UFC fight. I only wanted to share this photo because it's, again, one of those moments where you start to realize what sport is doing. This photo composed of lawyers, IT professionals, doctors, nurses, bouncer, right? This photo composed of all these people looks a lot like this photo, right? So another one of those things where when I was taking this photo, I felt ridiculous, but I'm like, what is going on? What is this community that we're seeking out? What are we actually doing fighting? Is it about learning to punch and kick, or is it about finding a space where you can take photos like this and be part of a community, where you can feel like you're connected to other people? And not just a coincidence, in this case, right, all men. Right? So where do you find these spaces of men to build these friendships and get together and talk about issues that both are about strengthening masculinity, about reinforcing traditional masculinity, maybe breaking some of the norms, maybe showing vulnerability, but where do you find spaces like that? Oh, I lied. That was not the final story. This is the final story I'll make, this final point I'll make, and then we'll go to my final concluding thoughts and some questions. The other thing that's happened very recently, we all know that a viral pandemic has occurred, right? We all have heard of the coronavirus. We all know about COVID-19. We also are aware of what's happening in many cities around the country and around the world, right? Where there's been all these high-profile cases of Black men and women being killed at the hands of cops or under the supervision of cops, right? We've seen this thing happen. Now, this has done interesting things in the world of sports. And again, I'm approaching this first as a fan. I'm someone who loves basketball. I'm also someone who loves MMA. And I can see how different sporting organizations have responded in different ways. And the responses they've done, the responses they've chosen has had dramatically different impacts in teaching fans how much to care about what they're seeing, right? So in the case of the NBA, we have Rudy Gobert test positive, an NBA player, the Utah Jazz test positive. Immediately, the NBA shuts down. This is seen as the moment in the United States where we suddenly started to take this thing really seriously. If the NBA is shutting down, then it must mean something. When the NBA returns, they're in a bubble where they're completely isolated. Everyone's getting tested. And not only are in this bubble where they have to leave their families and friends to be able to stay safe and play sport, right? But they're saying we're going to do this not only if we're safe, we have to be safe, number one, but we also need to be able to speak out about social justice issues, right? You can see players wearing shirts that say Black Lives Matter. You can see players wearing shirts that say their names, or equality, or vote, right? Saying something about what's going on in the world. I'm seeing this as a fan. In contrast, while I'm watching basketball, I'm also watching what MMA, especially the Ultimate Fighting Championship, does. The Ultimate Fighting Championship, of president of the UFC, Dana White, he says, we are not going to stop. We are going to continue to hold events. We will hold live events. We won't have an audience because it won't be allowed, but we are going to do everything possible not to stop, right? And can contrast the NBA saying safety first. The UFC says the show must go on. We're going to work harder than everyone else, and we're going to show that the economy doesn't have to slow down. At the same time, you have Dana White again saying to his athletes, I am not going to speak out about something like Black Lives Matter. Politics don't belong in the sport. When his athletes do speak out, they do not get the approval of Dana White, or if they say something that's seen as racist, they also don't get his condemnation. He's saying, I'm not involved in anything political. This is simply sports. However, at the same time as he's doing this, he goes and speaks at the GOP convention, right? The big Republican gathering where people get to say, this is who we're going to run for president. In this case, we're going to have Donald Trump run again for president. Dana White speaks, one of the featured speakers on the second day. So even as he says politics should not be in sport, he goes and does this. How does this relate to me? Again, as a fan, I'm watching these two sports that I care about the most, basketball and mixed martial arts, and I'm seeing two very different paths being taken. Now I'm taking that passion as a fan and I'm writing an article comparing these two sports and how they and the politics in both. All right, final point I'll make. The final thing I want to end with is just saying your story matters. Now, that sounds very self-helpy, right? It sounds like every one of you is perfect. Every one of you is wonderful. Even if you're not perfect, like your story matters. That's probably true. But I actually want to make the opposite point. It's not that your story matters because it's interesting or exciting or wonderful. It might not be all of those things. I'm actually embarrassed to share the stories that I did with you today because I don't even think any of them are actually that interesting, right? I might be overly self-critical, but I find them all kind of boring. The reason they matter is because your story matters because your background gives you insight into something. At the very least, you are an expert in those experiences that you've had. If you grew up on a street corner in the Bronx, you know the experience of growing up on that street corner in the Bronx more than a sociologist going to study that area, right? Maybe an historian could tell you the background of how the city came to be that way. Maybe a sociologist can talk about how some of the policies affect people and some interesting things that are occurring. That's possible, but you're an expert in your life and the encounters that you've had. I'm an expert in the things that I've experienced. I know what it was like to grow up in Gilbertsville, New York. I've had these stories that have influenced what I've gone on to study, right? So take advantage of your story, not because it's necessarily exciting to someone else, because it gives you some sort of authority. Don't treat those experiences you've had as a waste of time. Don't say to yourself, oh, I just grew up and had a boring, ordinary life. There's nothing, right? That means you grew up in a dominant way of living in the United States. That tells us something. All your stories are insightful. When you go on and do research, don't forget about why those things matter. So hopefully me sharing, I think I shared 6 or 7 moments. I originally planned on 5, but I added 1 or 2. Hopefully that gives you some insight into both why I'm passionate about sport, but also how those disjunctions and those moments of uncomfortableness have taught me why sport can matter, why it's worth looking at. So I will end there, and thank you for giving me your time, and hopefully we've got some questions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Green. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, perfect. We do have a few questions. Let's see, starting from the beginning, there are a couple comments about UFC 123, which I guess I'm not sure what that means.
Oh, UFC 123 was one of the events that just happened. Were there questions around it?
No, he was just commenting on it.
Okay.
So starting, let's see, the first question, how'd you manage to drive the car after the engine caught on fire?
Oh, that was it wasn't a bad fire. The answer is not all fires are as bad as they seem. So my father, who like I was saying, I didn't grow up in a wealthy background, but my father was good with cars. So he was able to get it running somehow, which just meant that I could get it running long enough before it broke down again. So it was always a very tiny fire, which made me jump out of the car and back away and be very scared, and then it would be fine. Yeah, good question.
All right. What brought you to start your podcast, and who do you view as a role model?
Role model with the podcast or role model in general in life?
The person doesn't really specify. I think they mean that as two separate questions. What brought you to start your podcast, and then separately?
Yeah, that's a good question. Then the podcast, it actually relates to the theme of passion pretty well. So I think that sociological ideas are really exciting. I think they're valuable. I think that the more people who think in a sociological way, if more people thought in a sociological way, it would actually make the world a better place, which sounds like a giant statement, but I honestly believe it. But the problem is that academic knowledge is often very inaccessible. And I would always teach methods. I would always teach theory. And I assign these books. And as you know, if you're taking theory with me, if you take theory with me in the future, you take a methods class, often the readings are very dry. But I knew there was exciting stuff underneath it. So the podcast is a way to talk to people doing exciting research right now and try to make it more accessible. Simply saying, hey, how did you choose the method that you are using to conduct research? What has gone well using that method? What's gone not so well? And people often explain it in a more understandable manner. So that was the motivation to start a podcast. I also think it's kind of cool if you're a student who's really busy, and this is true of a grad student, this is true of an undergrad student, maybe it's just true of someone like just interested in sociological theory or methods. Instead of sitting down and reading an article, you can listen to a podcast while you're driving to work, right? So it's kind of a cool new format. In terms of role model questions, that's always a really hard one. I've had different role models for different things throughout my life. So I've found academics who I've been really, who I consider role models because they use their research and connect and actually influence policy. That's kind of cool. I'd say in terms of someone who just inspires me all the time, Paul Farmer he's a famous doctor who's gone around the world bringing healthcare to people who do not have healthcare. There's this amazing book called Mountains Beyond Mountains, which looks at how much money he's raised and how many resources he's brought to people. He's someone who actually went back and got his PhD in anthropology because he realized that culture matters and influences the health practice we engage in. Every time I wonder if we can actually do good things for other people, he's the person I think about. So Paul Farmer would be my answer.
Okay, great, thanks. Next one is, so what exactly did you take away from taking part in the sports that you did? And then what did they make you realize about yourself and society?
Oh, that's a good question. There's some really good lessons. All the reasons that we celebrate sport, I think those are real, right? So it does teach perseverance. It does teach you not to give up. it is good for your health. Like it teaches teamwork, it builds community. So all those things that we want to celebrate, I did find those things. One of the other lessons over and over that it taught me was that whenever there's a group formed, there's also people left out of that group. So, right. So how is it that tennis has this class background where it often excludes people who are from a more working class? So those were some of the things that I thought about, and it taught me about society. The bigger lesson, I mean, that question is great. I actually teach sport and society, and we work through that for a whole semester. So I'm trying to think of a really short way to answer it. One of the lessons that I've taken away from my experience is the activities we engage in play a huge role in shaping how we see the world. And often we dismiss that, right? If you're going and playing a sport, it's just a hobby. It's just something fun. If you're taking a yoga class, it's just an activity to engage in, right? But those stories that we tell, those conversations we have there, those have a dramatic impact in shaping who we are as people. My experience playing basketball shaped my understanding of race in the United States, which is kind of a funny thing to talk about, right? Race is this huge issue in the United States. We're seeing an outpouring of tension across the United States, again, across the world related to this topic. Me going to basketball camp, me playing basketball influenced the way I see race. Training in MMA has shaped the way that I understand how people search for meaning in the world, right? How people build identity. I didn't fully understand that until I started training in MMA. Like things I didn't expect from entering those spaces, but those are some of the takeaways. And hopefully that answers your question. But if not, take sport and society. I'd love to talk about more.
Thank you. Okay, next one is, do you think sports franchise response changes the way people think?
I'm wondering, I don't know if you're talking about in terms of politics or maybe COVID. I will say yes, though. I think it does. Now, there's a limitation to that, right? So a player simply putting on a shirt that says Black Lives Matter, or the NBA simply painting Black Lives Matter on a court, that doesn't mean immediately you see that and you say to yourself, oh, I get the political messaging. I understand why people are engaged in the social movement. I agree with it. Doesn't necessarily do that. But I think on at least a very simple level, it makes you say, why are they painting on that in the court? Why do those players think that matters so much? And you might end up rejecting it, or you might end up agreeing with it. But at least it forces for that split second some sort of thought. So I do think it matters there. When the UFC continues to hold events, live events without stopping, right? When we see other institutions shutting down, that does something, right? They show that they can still do that. The president saying that the president of the UFC saying coronavirus isn't a big deal, that's a lesson to the fans. The fans could reject what he says, but on some fundamental level, maybe on a subconscious level, they hear that person saying it. That is a person that they admire. It has an impact.
Thank you. And then somewhat on the same subject here, many athletes started kneeling during the national anthem. What message do you think that conveys?
All right. So as a good sociologist, I cannot say what message it conveys to the people receiving. I can't say how you receive that message, right? You could have two people watch players kneel and get different responses. Now, we could look to players who have said why they're kneeling and what their message is. And from that perspective, the message has been pretty clear. The athletes kneeling are saying, hey, we don't want to disrespect the country. We don't want to disrespect the military. What we do want to bring light to is the suffering of a percentage of the population in the United States who are not treated justly. So that's why we're kneeling. Until we feel that everyone has equality, we will continue to kneel. So that's the message that's intended to be put out, right? That's what the athletes have told us. We can read op-eds that NFL players have written on the subject. We can read interviews with NBA players. That's the message that's intended to be put out. Now, clearly not everyone receives that message in the same way. It's been divisive. Some fans love it. Some fans really appreciate players doing that. Other fans don't care, and they're saying, hey, we don't really care what they do one way or another. Other people are really angry about it, saying this is what's bringing politics into sports. Now, we can see those. So asking what message it conveys, that's really hard to know. It's hard to know what people are getting, and we can do research on that, but we can ask, what are the players trying to say, and why are they making that decision? I'm also going to move slightly so I can plug in my computer, which might die soon. But you can
All right.
keep asking questions.
No problem. Thanks. Okay. No, I'm not sure what specifically this is referring to, but maybe you'll. Why do you feel these differences will cause a change in the future of sport? Not sure what differences.
Yeah, can you elaborate? I'm happy to try to answer that, especially maybe you're talking about political differences. But yeah, maybe you can elaborate. And it's potentially an awesome question. I'm just not sure exactly how to answer.
Yeah, I'm sure it probably correlated to the time when you were speaking, but let's see. We'll go on to the next one, and if that person can clarify a little bit, add that back into the chat, and we'll ask at the end. Okay, so going on to the next one. Do you think that you will keep your focus on sports for the entirety of your career, or will you study other topics in sociology? I think that studying sports is very interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Oftentimes people stay focused on one area simply because as you do research, you build a name in that area, you get to know the literature in that area. It's hard to start completely new projects. One of the things that I often try to do is co-author with people who are studying a similar type of process, but outside of sport. So the article that I published a year ago in a sociological theory journal, I co-authored with someone who studies people who convert to Eastern Orthodox religion, which seems like a very different process, but we compared how people choose to convert to Eastern Orthodox religion to how people choose to start training in mixed martial arts, right? So looking both within sport and then outside of sport. And I want to continue to do that because in a way, that's one of my ways of showing, look, we can learn a lot about sport and we can also not just learn about what happens in sport. We're learning something that's fundamental to being a human, fundamental to being part of society. Sport is one of the ways to look at it. I could study something like music, and what I would hope is that I wouldn't only be doing something interesting to people who care about music, but I'd be interesting to people outside of that as well. So for all my articles that I write about sports, whether it's about sports and politics, whether it's about sports and gender, whether it's about sports and building community, I'm hoping it interests people outside of that as well. I'll probably remain in some capacity studying sports for my whole career. One of the things that I often shift between doing as well is my research on mixed martial arts. It started out with me specifically training in MMA as a way of understanding the topic. As I get older, as I get injuries, I've slowly stopped training. So now when I do research, it's from a different perspective, right? If I'm writing about sports and politics, I can do that from an outsider versus being an insider. But thank you for saying it's interesting, though. That's good to hear.
All righty, next one is, so would you say that sports players depend on their sports in order to have an identity?
Yeah.
And how does that impact sports players?
Yeah, I think completely. I think it happens from a young age, right? If you're really into sports, not everyone. Some people just play it as an activity, as a hobby, very casual. People who are very committed to it from a young age, that becomes part of their identity, and that's for better or worse, right? Positive values get passed down, sometimes negative values. One of the challenges for people is finding an identity once they are no longer an athlete. So I had that article I wrote about binge drinking among ex-athletes. What we found is the group that has the highest rates of binge drinking are people who were very competitive in high school and then stop right before or as they enter college. That's a group that's searching for this new release, searching for this new excitement, searching for this new identity. So we can see that being a struggle, right? So that's one of the challenges that happens as you leave sport behind, trying to figure out who you are. If you can no longer say, hey, that's Joe, the football player, or that's Nancy, the soccer player, right? Once you leave that, what do you start to do? What makes you get up in the morning? What makes you have a routine? For professional athletes, we've seen a lot of examples of this. I was actually just listening to an interview with Steve Nash, who was MVP basketball player, one of the top basketball players, top point guards of all time. He retired not that long ago, and he just got hired as the Brooklyn Nets head coach next year. And he was talking about how he took a few years off from the game, and one of the things that he really struggled with was what he said: professional athletes have two deaths. The first time they die is when they stop being a professional athlete. The second time they die is the same as everyone else. But when he stopped being a professional basketball player, he didn't know what to do, right? He wanted to leave the game behind for a little bit because he had to figure out who Steve Nash was when he wasn't NBA player Steve Nash. Now he's returning to being a coach, but he said he would not do that until he could also say, I can exist without basketball. So I think it is a huge part of identity. That's not necessarily bad, but we have to acknowledge that. And that's very true of college athletes as well. There's a lot of college athletes at Brockport who are not going to play professionally. That means something.
All right, thank you. Okay, let's see. For an essay that would be a good topic to write about, but include everything. I'm not sure what the question exactly is here. It says, for an essay, what would be a good topic to write about, but including everything you talked about?
I don't know if you could. I mean, well, I guess, all right, I take that back. If I were writing an essay, I would not include all this stuff, right? There's too much going on. You could write an essay about each individual story that I told, but if you're trying to think what are the takeaway points, I would say the takeaway points is your personal background matters, right? That idea of your story matters, not because it's necessarily exciting to someone else, but you have expertise through your experiences. That's something that we all have, whether we've been an athlete, whether we were a music fan, whether we were a farmer, like anything that we've done, any experiences we've had, those experiences are things that you know about on some deep level. So that's potentially an essay you could explore. The other thing that I think is really important is I chose stories where I both was in a scene, I was part of a group, I had a passion that I shared with other members of the group, but I also felt a little bit out of place. And I think that's really significant. That's the reason all those stories have remained with me. There are lots of times where I didn't feel out of place at all, but those out of place moments are the things that I've continued to explore. So that's something you could potentially write about as an essay. You know, how are you both part of a group but not part of a group? We experience that a lot. You go off to college, you're in a new space. How do you feel like you belong, and how do you feel like you don't belong, and what do we learn from that? So that's an idea off the top of my head.
All right, thank you. Let's see. Next one is, who would you argue had a bigger impact in women's MMA on a global level? Rhonda, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, Rousey, yeah, and her exposure, or Amanda Nunes and her dominance along with becoming a double champ?
That's a very good question. That's clearly someone who's an MMA fan. So in terms of, the question was who had more of an impact? Mm-hmm. I think the answer has to be Ronda Rousey. So she was this person who helped, for people who aren't fans of the UFC or haven't paid attention, she was the first person who really popularized women's MMA, which is, I mean, that's actually a little bit of exaggeration. There were people before her. There were people like Gina Carano, like Chris Cyborg. But she was the person who really got that exposure. She was featured in Sports Illustrated. She was on ESPN. She was one of the reasons the UFC started having fights, women fights, and they could headline cards. So in terms of that impact, she's had the biggest impact. In terms of just showing how good a woman could be at this sport, Amanda Nunes has had a bigger impact in that regard, right? She's been the most dominant women fighter of all time. She's incredible in all facets of the competition. She's an incredible athlete. But just in terms of impact, you have to go with the person who's been more groundbreaking, and that was Ronda Rousey. So that's how I would answer that. Okay,
great. And I am down to the last question. So if anybody has any last minute ones, get them in right now. We're on about a 1 minute delay, so we'll give it a minute or two. But this last one is going back to that one that we needed some clarification on.
Oh, yeah.
And he's saying, yes, political wise, does the difference in sport player believe in change people's fans' mindset?
I think it's too early to know, right? I don't know. I don't know if a fan watching an NBA player or a WNBA player say that we need to pay attention to what happened to Breonna Taylor is going to change things immediately. It's really hard to change what people believe. That's a very slow process. It's through exposure to repeated exposure. It's about a willingness to actually change, right? So that stuff isn't easy. I think the thing that we can say is that the players we saw this with the WNBA, have exerted the power they have to also push in areas where there can be immediate change, right? So the players and the coaches push the owners to turn NBA stadiums into areas where people can vote. On a very fundamental level, that increases people's access to exercising their democratic right to vote. So that's an immediate change that we can see. We've seen players push their owners, and their owners, right? These are some of the most powerful people in the world. These are you have to be a billionaire to own an NBA team. We've seen players push their owners to exert their political, exert pressure on their political networks to change different laws that exist in different cities related to body cameras, related to what people have the right, which people have the right to vote. So we've seen players actually push for real change as well. Whether it leads to change in what you believe, that's hard to know. I would guess, I feel relatively safe guessing that's at least forced some people to do some research that they would not have otherwise. If you see an NBA player saying after a game, say a player hits a game-winning shot like Jamal Murray for the Nuggets, and they ask him how it felt to win the game, and immediately after the game, he also points to his shoes that have the name Breonna Taylor and George Floyd on it. If you haven't been paying attention to those cases, you're probably going to look them up, right? So maybe it doesn't change your opinion. Maybe suddenly you don't say, oh, I want a different law to be passed, or I want to vote for a different person. But you're probably going to be a little bit more informed. And on some level, that's kind of impressive, right? When you turn on the TV to watch a sporting event, you don't expect to be doing that. And I think at least that occurs. But that's a really good question. And again, everyone interested, take Sport and Society. I want to talk about this more.
Great, thanks. Okay, there was one more that came in. Let me see. When did you stop practicing MMA?
That's a good question. So I trained through grad school the whole time that I was doing research and writing my dissertation. Sorry, I was too ambitious thinking that my computer wouldn't die, but the battery's still low. Let me just plug it in. So I trained through grad school. When I moved to Utica, New York, I started as a professor at Utica College. I stopped training for a bit just because I was too busy. I also wasn't sure exactly what my motivation to train was at that point. And actually, one of the articles that I want to write in the future is the sociology of quitting. So think about why people actually leave activities they're involved in. No one's really researched that. And I'm really fascinated with that idea. Why do we stop doing something that we say we care about? But so I stopped when I went to Utica College for a few years. My third year at Utica College, I was planning on starting to train again. I checked out a local gym. I really liked the gym a lot. And then a week later, I was hiking with my dog, and I slipped on the ice and I broke my ankle. So that made it so I wasn't able to train for a while. So that pushed back, delayed me even further in getting back into it. Last year, I started training in Muay Thai again because I wanted to start writing. I really wanted to start putting out, publishing some more articles, and I also just missed the activity. So I started training in Muay Thai again, and then a month after I started training, coronavirus hit. And I haven't been back to the gym since. So first time I started returning to the gym, I broke my ankle. Second time was a coronavirus. So I don't know, maybe I'm to blame for everything.
All right, there is actually one more. They're trickling in here. What grade can you take Sport and Society? Okay, so
yeah, really good question. So I teach Sport and Society every spring. You do have to take Intro to Sociology before you take it. Beyond that, it doesn't really matter your grade. If you take an Intro to Sociology, you could it's a 300 level course, but you could take it your second semester if you've taken Intro to Sociology. If you haven't taken any sociology classes, it would be hard to take your first year. There is some theory in there. There is some dense reading, but it's a really fun course. Even if you haven't taken Intro to Sociology, by the time in your spring of your second year, if you emailed me, I would let you in. But technically, you're supposed to take Intro. That's the prereq.
Oh, all right. Thank you. Looks like we got a couple more in here. Okay. Oops, sorry. Okay. What kind of dog?
Because I broke my ankle with a dog.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So the dog is a mix of a Great Pyrenees and a Spanish Mastiff, which means he's 100 pounds. So when you're walking on something really icy and he gets excited because there was like a squirrel or some animal and he pulled towards the river and I slipped and there was a tree root under the snow. So when he's pulling and a tree root is going the other way, that's why I broke my ankle. He's a great dog other than that, but it's a lot easier if your dog isn't 100 pounds.
Yeah. All right, and last one, and we'll make this the last one. Did you ever write or talk on your podcast about the Kings versus Lakers Tim Donaghy? I'm not sure how to say that scandal.
No, that's I'm surprised someone knew that. I feel like that's getting old enough that people don't know. So for people who don't know, the Sacramento Kings in the early 2000s were in my mind, one of the greatest basketball teams ever. And they went against the Los Angeles Lakers in the playoffs. And the referees called a lot of fouls for the Lakers to the point that some politicians called for an investigation into whether there was a fix of the game. Later on, there was some information about that referees involved in that series and some other playoff series actually had been making money off gambling. On the podcast, I don't talk about it. In my own personal life, I talk and complain about that a lot. And in Sport and Society, we talk about sports and gambling. But no, I don't have, the podcast episodes are pretty focused on what other researchers are doing related to sport. Yeah, so I haven't talked about it, but I'm impressed someone knows that. And if they ever do want to talk about that, I'm happy to do so.
Okay, great. So I will wrap it up then. If there is any more questions that trickle in, I can pass them along to Dr. Green to get back to later. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us tonight, Dr. Green?
I guess the only thing I would say, right, I can't see any of you, which is too bad. You're all asking really good questions. This was fun. And I didn't know how it would go because, again, I can't see you when I'm giving my talk. If you're ever interested in talking to any professor, because you're interested in what they do, you're interested in the major, you're interested in a course, take advantage of office hours, email a professor, even though it's digital at this point, say, hey, can I stop by in your office hours and talk via Microsoft Teams or whatever software? If they ignore you, then it's probably not a professor you want to take a class with anyway. So I'd say their loss and not your loss. But if you ever want to talk to me about anything, if you're ever interested in sociology, if you're interested in taking a course with me, interested in something I talk about that I spoke about today, feel free to email me and I'll send you the link for office hours. But take advantage of that with all your professors. I really encourage you, don't just go to office hours if there's an assignment that you don't understand. Feel free to talk about this type of stuff. Ask a professor, why did you become a biologist? Why are you a biologist who studies inchworms? I don't know, like ask those questions. That's interesting. That's how you get to know people, so don't hesitate to do that. So that's my final word.
All righty. Great. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Please make sure to get your papers done within the next week and submitted. Have a good night, everyone.
Sue.
Yep, and thank you, Dr. Green, for being here.
All right, bye.